They found her signing away her future in exchange for survival. Alice Whitmore, daughter of a ruined viscount, stood in the rain-soaked drawing room of a crumbling estate, sealing a contract that would bind her to a stranger for her family's safety. The Duke of Ravensmore needed an heir. She needed a miracle. What neither expected was that duty would become desire, that a marriage born in coldness would burn with passion, and that love would grow where only obligation was meant to exist. The rain came softly at first, a gentle tapping against the windows of Whitmore Hall that matched the rhythm of Alice's embroidery needle. She sat in the drawing room, her back straight despite the ache between her shoulders, working by candlelight to save the cost of oil lamps. The fire had burned low hours ago. No one had come to tend it. Around her, the house breathed with the particular silence of dying things. Dust gathered in corners that used to gleam. Portraits of ancestors stared down from walls where the paper peeled like old skin. The air smelled of tallow and dried herbs, of genteel poverty masked by good posture and careful speech. Alice pushed the needle through fabric that had been turned and re-hemmed so many times, the original pattern had disappeared. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, even as her mind calculated and recalculated numbers that never added up to anything but ruin. Across the room, her mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. Lady Margaret Whitmore had perfected the art of being present while utterly absent, her grief for her dying husband already dressed in widow's weeds, though he still drew breath upstairs. 17-year-old Catherine huddled by the window, pressing her face to the cold glass. She had stopped asking when things would get better. The silence was worse than her tears had been. Alice set down her embroidery and stood, smoothing her dress with hands that wanted to tremble, but had forgotten how. She moved through the house like a general surveying a lost battlefield, noting each new crack in the plaster, each piece of furniture that had quietly disappeared to pay another creditor. The study door stood ajar. She should not enter. Her father's domain had always been forbidden to the women of the house, even now when he lay fevered and senseless in his bed. But Alice had stopped caring about should and should not 3 months ago, when she had discovered the wine merchant would no longer extend credit. She pushed the door open. Papers covered the desk in chaotic layers, bills and demands and notices that screamed their urgency in red ink and official seals. Alice lit a candle and began to sort through them with methodical precision. Every lady should know her household accounts, her mother had once said, back when knowing meant tallying linens and planning menus, not calculating how long they could eat if they sold the silver. Her hands stilled on a thick envelope, bearing a seal she did not recognize. The paper was expensive, the kind that whispered of old money and older power. She broke the seal. Inside, she found documents. A contract dated 15 years prior, signed in her father's flourishing hand. Notes of hand, promissory notes, records of gambling debts that made her stomach turn. And there, in language as cold as a headstone, the truth that shattered what remained of her world. Whitmore Hall no longer belonged to them. It had not belonged to them for over a decade. The Blackwood family held the deed, the mortgage, the very ground beneath their feet. They had been living in a house that was already lost, breathing air that belonged to someone else. Alice sat down in her father's chair, the papers clutched in her hands. The numbers swam before her eyes. The debts were massive, impossible. Her father had gambled away everything and then borrowed against nothing, spinning a web of promises he could never keep. She thought of her mother's vacant stare, of Catherine's frightened eyes. She thought of her father upstairs, dying without the courage to confess what he had done. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like a physical thing, pressing down until she could barely breathe. A sound from above made her look up. Footsteps, hurried and uneven. Then her mother's voice, thin and breaking. "Alice, come quickly." She climbed the stairs knowing what she would find. Her father's room smelled of sickness and camphor, of the particular sweetness that preceded death. The doctor stood by the bed, his face grave. Her mother clutched Catherine's hand, both of them pale as ghosts. Viscount Whitmore lay against pillows that had once been white, his breathing shallow and labored. His eyes found Alice, and in them she saw the terrible weight of knowledge. He knew she had found the papers. He knew she understood. "I am sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. "So sorry." Alice moved to his side and took his hand. It felt like paper, dry and weightless. She wanted to rage at him, to demand how he could have done this to them, to her. But looking at his sunken face, she found only a terrible, aching pity. "It will be all right," she lied, her voice steady. "We will manage, Father. Rest now." His eyes closed, and she watched his chest rise and fall with the slow rhythm of a man surrendering to the inevitable. Behind her, Catherine began to cry softly. Her mother remained silent, already dressed for mourning in her heart, if not yet in her clothes. Alice stood at the window and looked out at the rain. Somewhere beyond those clouds, beyond the borders of their crumbling estate, the Blackwood family waited. They owned everything now, every stone and beam, every memory trapped in these walls. The house that had sheltered 5 generations of Whitmores was nothing more than a castle built on sand, and the tide was coming in fast. Alice pressed her forehead against the cold glass and made herself a promise. She would not let her family drown. Whatever it took, whatever she had to sacrifice, she would keep them safe. Even if it meant signing away more than a house, even if it meant signing away herself. The rain fell harder, and somewhere in the darkness, thunder rolled like a warning of storms yet to come. Viscount Whitmore died 3 days later, just before dawn, when the world was still grey and undecided between night and morning. Alice had been sitting vigil by his bedside, her hand in his, when she felt the last breath leave his body like a secret being released into the air. She did not cry. There would be time for tears later, in private, where no one could see her break. Instead, she closed his eyes gently, straightened the bedclothes, and went to wake her mother and sister. The funeral was a small affair, conducted on a Thursday morning under skies the colour of old pewter. The village church stood at the edge of the estate, its stones dark with rain and age. Inside, the pews that should have been filled with neighbours and friends stood mostly empty. Alice noticed the absences like missing teeth in a smile. The Hendersons, who had dined with them every Christmas, the Worthings, whose daughter had been Catherine's childhood companion, the Ashfords, distant cousins who had always made a show of family connection. All of them had found reasons to stay away, as if poverty were a contagious disease that could be caught through proximity. Only a handful of tenants came, their faces weathered and sympathetic. They had loved her father in the way one loves a kind but foolish man, with affection tempered by exasperation. They came not for him but for Alice, who had visited their homes during her father's illness, who had listened to their troubles when the estate could no longer help them. The vicar spoke words that Alice did not hear. She stood between her mother and Catherine, both of them leaning on her as though she were the only solid thing in a world turning liquid. Her black dress was borrowed, hastily altered. Her gloves had a small tear at the thumb that she kept hidden in the folds of her skirt. When the service ended, they followed the coffin to the small family plot behind the church. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from the yew trees, making soft sounds like whispered condolences. The gravediggers lowered her father into the earth with practiced efficiency, and Alice watched the coffin disappear, thinking of all the things that were being buried with him: security, status, the illusion of a future that looked anything like the past. Her mother and Catherine left with the vicar's wife, who had offered tea and a warm fire. Alice stayed behind, standing at the edge of the grave as the workers filled it in. She needed these moments alone, needed to feel the full weight of what had happened before she put on her armor and returned to the business of survival. The sound of hoofbeats on wet gravel made her turn. A carriage rolled into the churchyard, black and gleaming, pulled by 4 matched horses that spoke of wealth so vast it needed no announcement. The family crest on the door was unfamiliar to her, though something about the rampant lion and crossed swords made her stomach tighten with recognition. The door opened and a woman descended. She was perhaps 60, dressed in grey silk that made the rain look shabby by comparison. Her face was handsome rather than beautiful, with the kind of bone structure that aged into distinction rather than ruin. Everything about her spoke of absolute control, from her posture to the way her eyes swept over Alice without seeming to blink. "Miss Whitmore," the woman said. Her voice was cultured, cool, entirely without sympathy. "I am Duchess Margaret Blackwood." The name hit Alice like a physical blow. Blackwood, the family that owned her home, her future, everything except the clothes on her back and the grief in her heart. "Your Grace," Alice said, forcing herself to curtsy despite the mud and her trembling legs, "you find us at a difficult time." The Duchess's expression did not change. "I find you exactly where I expected to, alone, grieving, and utterly without options." The words were cruel in their accuracy. Alice felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. "If you have come to discuss the estate matters, perhaps we might do so at a more appropriate time." "There is no appropriate time for what must be discussed." The Duchess gestured toward the carriage. "Come, we will speak in private." It was not a request. Alice glanced toward the grave, at the fresh earth that covered her father, and felt a wild urge to refuse, to tell this cold-eyed woman that she had no right to summon her like a servant. But pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She climbed into the carriage. The interior smelled of leather and lavender. The seats were upholstered in midnight blue velvet, and a small lamp cast golden light over surfaces polished to a mirror shine. The Duchess settled across from her with the air of someone conducting business in her own parlor. "You know that your father's debts are extensive," the Duchess began without preamble. "You know that Whitmore Hall has belonged to my family for over a decade. What you may not know is the full extent of what is owed." She produced a leather folder from beside her seat and opened it. Inside were documents, contracts, letters written in her father's increasingly desperate hand. Alice forced herself to look at the numbers, though each one felt like a stone being added to a weight already crushing her chest. "Your mother and sister cannot remain in the house without my family's continued generosity," the Duchess continued. "That generosity has limits. However, I am prepared to offer a solution that would benefit us both." Alice's hands tightened in her lap. "What kind of solution?" The Duchess closed the folder with a soft snap. "My son requires a wife. You require security. I propose a marriage." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and terrible. Alice stared at the woman across from her, searching for some sign that this was a cruel joke. She found none. "Your son," Alice said carefully, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "I do not even know his name. Harry Blackwood, Duke of Ravensmore. He is 36, a widower and in need of heirs to secure the succession. You are young, healthy, and well-bred despite your current circumstances. The match is suitable. Suitable." The word was like ashes in Alice's mouth. "And what does your son think of this arrangement?" "My son will do as duty requires," the Duchess said with absolute certainty, "as will you if you are wise." Alice felt the world narrowing around her, all the paths that had once seemed possible collapsing into this single dark corridor. She thought of her mother, fragile and lost, of Catherine, 17 and terrified, with no prospects and no protection, of the house that was no longer theirs and the debts that would follow them like shadows wherever they went. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked, hating the shake in her voice. The Duchess's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a hint of satisfaction crossing her features. "All debts forgiven, a lifetime pension for your mother and sister, sufficient for them to live in comfort. They may remain at Whitmore Hall for as long as they wish, or I will provide them with a suitable residence elsewhere. In exchange, you will marry my son within the month and fulfill your duties as Duchess of Ravensmore. And if I refuse, then you will have refused the only offer you are likely to receive. The carriage will return you to your family, and in 3 weeks' time, the bailiffs will arrive to collect on the debts your father left behind. Your mother will lose her home. Your sister will have no dowry, no prospects, no future worth speaking of. And you, Miss Whitmore, will have the satisfaction of your pride and nothing else." Alice closed her eyes. She saw Catherine's frightened face, heard her mother's thin voice calling her name. She thought of the grave behind the church, of her father who had loved them but lacked the courage to protect them. The weight of their survival settled on her shoulders, heavy as a crown and twice as binding. "When will the wedding take place?" she asked, and felt something inside her go very still and cold. The Duchess allowed herself a small, grim smile. 3 weeks from today. I will send the details." Alice nodded once, a sharp dip of her chin that felt like signing her own death warrant. The Duchess reached forward and placed a gloved hand briefly on Alice's knee, the gesture almost kind. "You are doing the right thing, child. In time, you may even come to see it as fortunate." Alice doubted that very much. She climbed from the carriage and stood in the churchyard, watching it roll away until it was nothing but a dark shape against the grey sky. Only then did she allow herself to look back at her father's grave. "I hope you are at peace now, Father," she whispered, "because I have just sold my future to buy theirs." The yew trees dripped their quiet sympathy, and Alice Whitmore, who would soon be Alice Blackwood, turned toward home with the taste of surrender bitter on her tongue, and the certain knowledge that she had just traded one prison for another. She only prayed the bars would be far enough apart to let her breathe. The letter arrived at Ravensmore Abbey on a grey morning, delivered by his mother's personal courier, with instructions that it required immediate attention. Harry Blackwood, 6th Duke of Ravensmore, broke the seal with fingers that had long ago forgotten how to tremble. Inside, in his mother's precise script, were 3 words that changed everything. "The marriage is arranged." He read the rest standing at the window of his study, watching fog roll across the grounds like something living. The letter detailed everything with his mother's characteristic efficiency: the girl's name, her age, her family's ruin, the date of the wedding. All of it presented as fait accompli, as though his consent were a formality rather than a requirement. Harry crumpled the letter in his fist and threw it into the fire. For 3 years he had lived in self-imposed isolation at Ravensmore, avoiding London, avoiding society, avoiding anything that might remind him of the man he had been before Charlotte died. The estate suited his temperament now, all grey stone and silent corridors, a monument to grief dressed up as a home. He walked through rooms where dust gathered on furniture draped in Holland covers. The ballroom stood empty, its chandeliers dark. The music room remained locked, the pianoforte inside slowly going out of tune because no one played it anymore. Even the portrait gallery had been closed, all those smiling Blackwood ancestors hidden behind closed doors because their happiness was an accusation he could not bear. Charlotte's death had been his fault. That truth lived in his bones, carved deeper than marrow. She had been visiting the tenants against his advice, bringing medicine and comfort to families struck by fever. He had told her it was dangerous. She had gone anyway because that was who Charlotte was, generous and fearless and utterly convinced of her own invincibility. The fever had taken her in 4 days. Harry had watched her die, helpless and enraged, as she burned from the inside out. Her last words had been an apology, as though she were the one who had failed him. He had not been able to speak. The grief had locked his throat closed, and by the time he found his voice again, she was gone. 3 years. 3 years of silence and solitude, of letting the estate run itself while he disappeared into books and brandy, and the kind of numbness that felt like drowning in slow motion. His mother had left him alone at first, respecting his grief. But grief had a shelf life in the eyes of duty, and his was long expired. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He did not turn. "Come," he said. Captain Frederick Ashford entered with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no. He was Harry's cousin, on his mother's side, handsome in a way that turned heads, with golden hair and blue eyes that sparkled with charm when he remembered to use them. He had served in Her Majesty's army with distinction, or so he claimed. Harry had never bothered to verify. "Cousin," Frederick said, dropping into a chair uninvited, "you look like death warmed over. Still brooding, I see." Harry poured himself a brandy despite the early hour. "What do you want, Frederick? Your mother sent word. I hear congratulations are in order. A new bride. How perfectly medieval of you both." The sarcasm was thick enough to cut. Harry took a long drink and said nothing. Frederick had been sniffing around Ravensmore more frequently in recent months, always with some excuse about family obligation or concern for Harry's well-being. The truth was more transparent. As things stood, if Harry died without a legitimate heir, Frederick would inherit everything. The title, the estates, the fortune. His cousin was waiting for him to fail. "The girl is from a good family," Frederick continued, examining his nails with affected disinterest. "Ruined, of course, but that hardly matters when one needs a womb more than a companion. Very practical, really. Your mother has always been practical. Harry set down his glass with enough force to make Frederick look up. You will speak of my future wife with respect, or you will leave. Frederick raised his hands in mock surrender. Of course, cousin. No offense intended. I simply think it all rather cold, this arrangement. But then again, cold is rather your specialty these days, is it not? The words landed like they were meant to, finding the soft places that still hurt. Harry turned back to the window, dismissing his cousin without another word. Frederick left, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall, and Harry was alone again with his thoughts and his ghosts. Upstairs, in the nursery wing, his son was dying. The thought came to him the way it always did, sudden and suffocating. George. 6 years old, pale as paper, with his mother's dark eyes and a constitution so fragile that a strong wind seemed capable of breaking him. The boy lived in the upper floors, attended by nurses and kept away from draughts and excitement, and anything resembling a normal childhood. Harry had not seen him in 2 days. He told himself it was to protect the boy, to keep him safe from illness or injury. The truth was more shameful. Looking at George meant seeing Charlotte, and seeing Charlotte meant remembering that she had died, giving him life. The boy was beautiful and broken, a living reminder of everything Harry had lost. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavy with reluctance and guilt. The nursery wing was warmer than the rest of the house. Fires kept burning day and night to ward off chill. The air smelled of camphor and milk, of childhood trapped in amber. Betsy, the head nurse, curtsied when she saw him. Your Grace. We did not expect you. How is he? Harry asked, though he could see the answer in her face. Resting, Your Grace. He took a little broth this morning. The new tonic seems to help with his breathing. Harry nodded and moved past her to the day nursery. George sat by the window, wrapped in blankets despite the warmth, looking out at the grounds with an expression far too old for his years. Toy soldiers stood arranged on the floor untouched. A picture book lay open on the table, its pages unturned. Hello, Father, George said without looking up. His voice was thin, like something heard through water. Harry's throat tightened. Hello, my boy. How do you feel today? The same. George finally turned to face him, and Harry saw the question in those dark eyes. The same question that had lived there for months. When can I go outside? Soon, Harry lied, the word ashes in his mouth. When the weather is warmer. It is always too cold or too damp or too dangerous. George said it without accusation, simply stating fact. Sometimes I think you have forgotten I exist. The words cut deeper than any blade. Harry crossed the room and knelt beside his son's chair, taking the small hand in his own. I could never forget you, George. You are the most important person in my life. Then why do you hide me away like something shameful? Why can I not have what other children have? Because I am afraid, Harry thought. Because I already lost your mother and I cannot bear to lose you too. Because keeping you locked up here is the only way I know how to keep you safe, even if it is killing you by inches. But he could not say any of that. Instead, he pulled George into an embrace, feeling the fragile birdcage of his ribs, the rapid flutter of his heart. The boy did not pull away, but he did not soften either. He simply endured, the way he endured everything. When Harry left the nursery, he carried the weight of his son's disappointment like stones in his pockets. He returned to his study and pulled out the letter his mother had sent, smoothing it against the desk. Alice Whitmore, 23 years old, from a respectable family fallen on hard times, by all accounts intelligent and dutiful, with no troublesome romantic attachments or scandalous history. She would marry him in 3 weeks, come to this house, and provide him with more heirs to secure the succession. She would have his name, his title, his protection, but she would never have his heart. That had been buried with Charlotte, locked away where no one could reach it or wound it again. This marriage would be exactly what his mother intended, a transaction, a duty performed. Nothing more. Harry looked up at the portrait above the fireplace. Charlotte smiled down at him, forever young, forever kind, forever out of reach. He raised his glass in a silent toast. Forgive me, he whispered, but I cannot do this again. The fire crackled. The house settled around him with its familiar sounds. And somewhere in the nursery wing, A small boy sat alone, waiting for a father who was too afraid to love him properly, and a future that seemed determined to repeat the past. In 3 weeks, Alice Whitmore would arrive. Harry would marry her, bed her when necessary, and keep his distance in all the ways that mattered. It was the only kindness he had left to offer, the only way he knew how to survive. The wedding took place on a Thursday morning under skies the color of bruised plums. Rain threatened but did not fall, as though even the weather could not commit to the occasion. Alice stood in the small anteroom of the private chapel at Ravensmoor, adjusting her dress with hands that had forgotten how to be still. The gown was simple, ivory silk with minimal ornamentation, borrowed from the Duchess's own wardrobe and hastily altered. It fit well enough, though Alice felt like an imposter wearing it, a girl playing dress-up in clothes meant for someone more significant. Catherine had woven pale roses into her hair that morning, crying silently the entire time. Her mother had kissed her forehead and said nothing at all. Through the door, Alice could hear the murmur of voices. There were perhaps 20 people in attendance, mostly Blackwood family and close associates. No one from Alice's side except her mother and sister, who sat in the front pew like mourners at a funeral. The door opened. Duchess Margaret appeared, dressed in charcoal grey that made her look like the mother of the groom at a wake rather than a wedding. "It is time," she said. Alice took a breath and stepped into the chapel. The space was small and cold, lit by candles that cast more shadow than light. The walls were old stone, the kind that held centuries of prayers and confessions. At the altar, beneath a stained glass window depicting some forgotten saint, stood Harry Blackwood. Alice's first thought was that he looked like a man attending his own execution. He wore black, unrelieved by any touch of color. His face was angular and handsome in a severe way, all sharp lines and careful control. His eyes were dark, almost black in the dim light, and when they met hers there was nothing in them. No warmth, no curiosity, not even polite interest, just a vast, careful emptiness that made her feel like she was marrying a ghost. She walked down the short aisle alone. There was no one to give her away, and she would not have wanted the charade anyway. This was not a father entrusting his daughter to a new protector. This was a transaction being formalized, a debt being paid in human currency. Harry watched her approach without expression. When she reached the altar, he did not offer his hand. She stood beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his body, but separated by a gulf wider than the chapel itself. The vicar began the ceremony with words Alice barely heard. She made her responses when required, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. Harry's voice was deep and utterly devoid of emotion, as though he were reciting a legal contract rather than wedding vows. "Do you, Harry Edmund Blackwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Do you, Alice Margaret Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do." The words felt like pebbles dropping into a well, disappearing into darkness without echo. The vicar pronounced them man and wife. Harry turned to her, bent his head in a perfunctory bow, and placed a kiss on her cheek, so brief and cold it might as well have been a handshake. Then it was done. She was Alice Blackwood, Duchess of Ravensmoor. The title sat on her shoulders like ill-fitting armor. The wedding breakfast was held in the formal dining room, a cavernous space where a handful of guests looked lost at a table meant for 40. The Duchess presided with military efficiency. Relatives made careful small talk that avoided any mention of happiness. Captain Frederick Ashford sat across from Alice, all golden charm and cold eyes. "How fortunate you are, Miss Whitmore," he said, emphasizing her maiden name. "From a ruined estate to Duchess, quite the fairy tale." Alice met his gaze. "I prefer to think of it as a marriage, Captain, though I suppose those unfamiliar with the institution might confuse it with other things." Frederick's smile sharpened. "The new Duchess has claws." Harry set down his fork with a soft click. "Frederick, you will speak to my wife with respect, or you will leave my table." Frederick inclined his head in mocking apology, but Alice saw the flash of anger in his eyes. She had made an enemy. The breakfast finally ended. Alice stood in the entrance hall accepting congratulations that felt like condolences. Harry stood beside her, close enough for appearances but never touching. When the last carriage departed, Duchess Margaret approached them. "I will leave you to settle in. Alice, Mrs. Holt will show you to your rooms. Harry, attend to your duties." The Duchess left. Suddenly they were alone in the vast hall, two strangers bound by law. Harry turned to her for the first time since the ceremony. His eyes swept over her with clinical assessment, as though cataloguing an acquisition. "There are things we need to make clear," he said. Alice lifted her chin. "Of course. This marriage is a matter of duty and necessity. Nothing more. You will have my name, my protection, and anything you require for your comfort. In return, you will fulfill your obligations as Duchess and provide heirs when I deem it appropriate." Each word landed like a stone. Alice forced herself to keep breathing, to maintain the dignity that was all she had left. "I understand," she said. Harry took a step closer. His presence was overwhelming, not because he tried to intimidate, but because he radiated a kind of controlled power that filled the space around him. "You will sleep in the Duchess's chambers in the East Wing," he continued. "However, until I require your presence, you will take your rest with the ladies and maids in their quarters. Consider it a practical arrangement. There is no need for the pretense of intimacy when there is none." The words hit her like a slap. Sleep with the maids. He was not just establishing distance. He was making a statement about her place in this house, in his life. She was wife in name only, relegated to servants' quarters, while the Duchess's rooms stood empty and mocking. Alice felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger and humiliation warring in her chest. But she had survived her father's death, her family's ruin, and a wedding that felt like a burial. She would survive this too. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Something flickered in Harry's eyes, too quick to name. Then it was gone, replaced by that terrible emptiness. "Mrs. Holt will show you where to go," he said. "If you need anything, inform the housekeeper. I will send for you when it is time." "Time for what?" she wanted to ask. "Time to perform your duty. Time to use me like a breeding mare and then send me back to the servants' quarters?" But she said nothing. She simply curtsied, the gesture somehow more cutting than words, and followed the housekeeper up the stairs. Mrs. Holt led her through corridors that grew simpler, away from grand apartments toward the working heart of the house. The room was clean but small, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking kitchen gardens. Other maids' rooms lined the hallway. This was where the Duchess would sleep, among servants, a reminder that she was not chosen, not wanted, barely tolerated. Alice sat on the narrow bed. Her hands shook, the day's control finally crumbling. She heard footsteps, whispers, servants discussing the strange Duchess sent to sleep with them. Then she heard it, faint, almost missed, a child crying, soft and hopeless, somewhere far above. Alice moved to the door. The corridor was empty. Maids returned to duties. She looked up, following the sound. Someone in this house was suffering as much as she was. She had married a duke who treated her like an inconvenience. She had been given a title, then told to sleep with servants. She had walked into a mausoleum pretending to be a home. But she was still Alice Blackwood, and she had not survived this long by accepting cruelty without question. Tomorrow, she thought, listening to that faraway crying. Tomorrow, I find out what else he is hiding. And perhaps I will discover what it takes to make a ghost feel something again. Alice woke to the sound of bells calling the household to morning prayers. Grey light filtered through her small window, illuminating a room that felt more like a cell than a chamber. She dressed quickly in one of the simple day dresses provided, her fingers fumbling with buttons she had once fastened with ease. The Duchess learning to dress herself. The irony was not lost on her. She found her way downstairs following the sound of activity. The servants' dining hall was crowded with maids and footmen, taking their breakfast before the family woke. Conversations died when she entered. Eyes followed her to an empty seat at the end of a long table. A young maid with red hair finally spoke. "Good morning, Your Grace. We were not expecting you here." Alice met her gaze steadily. "This is where I have been told to take my meals. I hope I am not intruding." The maid flushed. "Of course not, Your Grace. It is only that, well, we have never had a Duchess breakfast with us before." "There is a first time for everything," Alice said quietly, and reached for the porridge. The meal was simple but filling. Around her, the servants gradually resumed their conversations, though their voices remained hushed. Alice learned their names, asked about their duties, and began to understand the invisible machinery that kept Ravensmoor running. After breakfast, Mrs. Holt appeared like a spectre in black bombazine. "Your Grace, you are expected in the morning room. The Duchess Margaret wishes to review your schedule." Alice followed the housekeeper through corridors she was only beginning to recognize. The morning room was decorated in pale green and gold, elegant but somehow lifeless. Duchess Margaret sat at a writing desk, her back straight as a blade. "Good morning, Alice. Please sit." Alice obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. "You will find life at Ravensmoor follows certain patterns," the Duchess began. "Breakfast in your quarters, unless otherwise instructed. Mornings will be spent with me, learning household management and your duties as Duchess. Afternoons are for correspondence and calls, though you will make no visits without my approval. Evenings you will dine with the family when required." "And my husband?" Alice asked, keeping her voice neutral. "The Duke keeps his own schedule. He will send for you when appropriate." The words stung, but Alice had expected nothing else. She spent the morning learning about linens and menus, about managing servants and maintaining appearances. The Duchess was an exacting teacher, correcting Alice's posture, her diction, the way she held her teacup. "You must understand," Margaret said at one point, "that being Duchess is not about what you want. It is about what the family requires. Harry may have his peculiarities, but the Blackwood name must remain above reproach." Alice absorbed the lesson in silence. By noon, her head ached and her jaw hurt from clenching her teeth. She was dismissed after luncheon and found herself wandering the house like a ghost. She passed servants who curtsied and avoided her eyes. She walked through reception rooms where furniture sat draped in holland covers, waiting for parties that never came. The house was enormous and utterly empty of life. In the portrait gallery, she found paintings of Blackwood stretching back generations. She stopped before a recent one, a young woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, painted in a garden filled with roses. The nameplate read, "Charlotte Blackwood, Duchess of Ravensmoor." Harry's first wife, George's mother, the woman whose death had turned this house into a tomb. Alice studied the painted face, searching for some clue to what Charlotte had been. She looked kind, the sort of woman who would visit sick tenants and play with her child, the sort of woman Harry had actually loved. "You will never be her," a voice said behind her. Alice turned. Frederick Ashford leaned against the doorframe, watching her with that calculating smile. "I have no intention of trying," Alice replied. "Good, because Harry keeps her memory locked away like a relic. You are simply the replacement he was forced to accept. Do not mistake duty for affection." He moved closer, and Alice held her ground despite the urge to step back. "Tell me, cousin, what do you want from this family?" "To survive it," Alice said honestly. Frederick laughed. "How refreshingly honest. Most would pretend to some higher purpose. But you and I understand each other, I think. We are both here by circumstance rather than choice. We are nothing alike, Captain, are we not? You married for security. I wait for inheritance. We both need Harry to fulfill certain requirements. He should not have been so careless with his first Duchess. Now we are all paying the price." The casual cruelty in his tone made Alice's stomach turn. She moved past him toward the door. "Excuse me, Captain. I find I have no appetite for this conversation." She heard his laughter follow her down the corridor. That night, Alice lay in her narrow bed listening to the house settle. Somewhere below, servants whispered and laughed. Somewhere above, that crying came again, soft and persistent. She had heard it every night since arriving. The sound haunted her, pulling at something deep in her chest. A child, alone and unhappy, in a house full of people who pretended not to hear. She could ignore it, as everyone else seemed to. She could stay in her place, follow the rules, be the obedient Duchess who slept with the maids and asked no questions. Or she could do what she had always done. She could act. Alice rose and pulled on her dressing gown. The corridor outside was dark and empty. She climbed the servants' stairs, following instinct and the faint sound of weeping. The house grew warmer as she ascended, Fires kept burning in the upper floors. At the top landing, she found a different world. The corridors here were carpeted, the walls papered in cheerful patterns. Light glowed beneath a door at the end of the hall. Alice approached and listened. The crying had stopped, replaced by a woman's voice singing a lullaby in words Alice could not quite make out. She knocked softly. The singing ceased. Footsteps approached and the door opened a crack. A middle-aged woman in a nurse's cap peered out, her face lined with exhaustion. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I am Alice Blackwood." I heard crying and wanted to help. The nurse's eyes widened. "Your Grace, you should not be here. The Duke has forbidden—" "Please," Alice interrupted gently. "I only want to see if the child is well." The nurse hesitated, then stepped back. Alice entered a nursery that was part sanctuary, part prison. Toys lined the shelves, but they looked untouched. Books sat in neat stacks. A fire burned in the grate, making the room almost stifling. In a small bed near the window lay a boy of perhaps 6, his face pale against white pillows. Dark eyes watched Alice with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Hello," Alice said softly, moving closer. "My name is Alice. What is yours?" "George," the boy whispered. "Are you an angel?" The question broke her heart. "No, darling, I am very much human, but I heard you crying and wanted to make sure you were all right." "I cry every night," George said matter-of-factly. "No one ever comes." Alice sat on the edge of his bed. "Well, I am here now. Will you tell me why you cry? Because I am alone. Because I am locked up here like something broken. Because my father is afraid I will die like Mama did." The nurse, who had introduced herself as Betsy, spoke quietly. "His Grace means well, Your Grace. He only wants to keep the young master safe." "Safe from what?" Alice asked. "From living." She turned back to George and touched his hand. It was small and warm, achingly fragile. "What would you like most in the world, George?" "To go outside," he said immediately. "To see the gardens, to run and play like other children. Simple wishes, impossible wishes in this house of fear." Alice made a decision that she knew was dangerous. "Tomorrow morning, early before the house wakes, would you like to see the gardens with me?" George's eyes went wide. "Truly, truly. But it must be our secret for now. Can you keep a secret?" He nodded so vigorously his hair fell into his eyes. Betsy looked terrified. "Your Grace, if the Duke discovers—" "Then I will face the consequences," Alice said firmly. "This child needs air and sunlight more than he needs another day trapped in this room." She stayed with George for an hour, reading him stories and answering his endless questions about the world beyond his windows. When his eyes finally grew heavy, she tucked the blankets around him and kissed his forehead. "Sleep now," she whispered. "Tomorrow is a new day." As she descended the stairs back to her small room, Alice knew she had crossed a line. She had disobeyed her husband's unspoken rules. She had interfered with something he had clearly forbidden. But she had also seen the light return to a small boy's eyes, and that was worth whatever punishment might come. In the morning, she would take George to the gardens. And if Harry Blackwood wanted to stop her, he would have to face her himself instead of hiding behind closed doors and cold commands. She slipped back into her narrow bed and closed her eyes, already planning tomorrow's rebellion. Above her, for the first time in nights, the crying had stopped. If you have found yourself drawn into Alice and George's story, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to the channel. And here is something I am curious about. If you were in Alice's position, would you have risked everything to help George, or would you have stayed silent to protect yourself? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I truly love hearing from you, and your perspective might inspire the next story I share. Alice woke before dawn and made her way up the servants' stairs with her heart hammering. Betsy waited outside George's door, pale with worry. "Your Grace, please reconsider. If the Duke discovers—" "He will discover his son is not made of glass," Alice said quietly. "Will you help me, or must I do this alone?" Betsy nodded and opened the door. George was already dressed, eyes bright with excitement and terror. "Are we truly going outside?" he whispered. "We are. But if you feel tired or unwell, you must tell me immediately." They descended through servants' passages to avoid the main corridors. The garden entrance was at the back of the house. Betsy produced a key that had not been touched in years. The lock gave way with a reluctant click. The door swung open. George stood at the threshold, staring out at a world he had only seen through windows. The garden beyond was wild, overgrown, beautiful in its abandonment. Rose bushes had grown into tangles. Ivy climbed walls and wrapped around benches. Morning mist hung low over the grass, making everything look like a painting slowly coming to life. "It is so beautiful," George breathed. Alice felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes, darling, it is." She led him outside, moving slowly, watching his face transform with each step. He touched wet grass with tentative fingers. He smelled roses that had bloomed without anyone to admire them. He laughed, a sound so pure and joyful that it seemed to crack something open in the air itself. They walked the garden paths together, Alice telling him the names of flowers while George asked 1,000 questions. "Can I pick one? Can we come back tomorrow? Why did no one tell me it was this wonderful?" "Because sometimes people forget that being alive is worth the risk of getting hurt," Alice said softly. George found a wild rosebush near a stone bench covered in moss. He carefully picked 3 blooms, red as heart's blood, and presented them to Alice with a courtly bow that must have been taught by some long-ago tutor. "For you," he said solemnly, "because you are kind." Alice accepted the flowers, pressing them to her chest. "Thank you, George. I will treasure them always." They sat on the bench together, Alice with her arm around the boy's thin shoulders, both of them watching the sun burn away the mist. George's breathing was steady, his color better than she had seen it. Being locked away had not been protecting him. It had been killing him by inches. A sound made her turn. Harry stood at the garden entrance. He was dressed for riding, all dark coat and leather boots, his hair slightly disheveled from the wind. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on the scene before him with an intensity that made Alice's breath catch. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Harry turned and walked away without a word. Alice felt her stomach drop. She had been caught, and the consequences would come. But looking at George, who was watching a butterfly land on his knee with absolute wonder, she could not make herself regret what she had done. They stayed another hour before Betsy appeared, anxiety written across her features. "Your Grace, we must return." George begged for more time, but Alice coaxed him inside with promises of tomorrow. In the nursery, he threw his arms around her neck. "Thank you for remembering I exist." The words shattered her. She would fight for him, whatever it cost. She returned, expecting a summons. It did not come. The morning passed in usual lessons with Duchess Margaret. Still nothing. Late afternoon, Mrs. Holt appeared. "His Grace requests your presence in the library, Your Grace." Alice's heart raced as she followed Mrs. Holt through the corridors. The library was vast, lined with books. Harry stood at the window, looking out at the gardens. Mrs. Holt withdrew. "You were told," Harry said without turning, "that my son is kept separate for his own protection." Alice lifted her chin. "I was told many things, Your Grace, including that I should sleep with servants and wait silently." He turned, something flickering in his eyes. "George is fragile. His constitution cannot withstand." "Imprisonment?" Alice interrupted. "You have locked him away from sunlight, from air, from any normal childhood. I am protecting him. You are suffocating him." She stepped forward. "I watched him touch grass for the first time in years." I heard him laugh. "When was the last time you heard your son laugh?" Harry's jaw tightened. "You know nothing about what I have endured, about what I have lost." "Then tell me," Alice said, her voice softening despite her anger. "Explain to me how keeping that beautiful boy locked in a tower honors your late wife's memory. Explain how letting him waste away protects anyone." "Charlotte died trying to help people," Harry said, and for the first time she heard raw pain in his voice. "She went to the tenants during the fever outbreak because she believed she could make a difference. She believed her duty was more important than her safety. And it killed her. So now you punish your son for her choice." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Harry crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping so close she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes, could smell sandalwood and leather, and something that made her pulse quicken. "You dare," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes," Alice replied, refusing to back down. "I dare. Because someone needs to say it. Someone needs to tell you that grief is not the same as love, and fear is not the same as protection." His hand caught her arm, not roughly but firmly enough to make her gasp. For a moment they stood frozen, his fingers wrapped around her wrist, her face tilted up to his. The air between them felt electric, charged with anger, and something else neither of them had names for. "You have been in this house less than a week," Harry said, his voice rough. "You have no right to judge what you do not understand." "Then help me understand," Alice whispered. "Stop hiding behind walls and let someone see you." Something in his expression cracked. His grip loosened, his thumb brushing her pulse point. She felt her heartbeat accelerate, heat bloom in her cheeks. "Charlotte would have done the same thing," Harry said quietly. "She would have taken him to the gardens. She would have defied me for his sake. Then perhaps you married the right person after all." He released her and stepped back. "You will continue to take George to the gardens, every morning, weather permitting. If his health worsens, this ends immediately. You are giving permission. I am acknowledging my methods may have been flawed. Do not mistake this for approval of your disobedience, and yet you are rewarding it. I am doing what is necessary for my son, nothing more." But Alice saw the truth. She had made him question the prison he had built. A small victory, but a victory. She curtsied. "As you wish, Your Grace." Harry looked at her for a long moment. "Alice," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. "Thank you for seeing what I could not." He turned back to the window, dismissing her, and Alice left with her heart racing. Something had shifted. Some wall had cracked. Tomorrow she would take George to the gardens again, and perhaps she would find a way to bring Harry with them, to show him that the only way to honor the dead was to remember how to live. The mornings became a ritual. Alice and George in the garden, the world slowly waking around them. George grew stronger daily, color returning to his cheeks, laughter coming easily. He ran now, climbed trees, fell and scraped his knee, and cried from joy at being allowed to fall like a normal child. Harry never joined them, but Alice felt him watching from windows, shadows in doorways, unable or unwilling to participate, but no longer preventing it. The change in George brought change to the house. Servants smiled more. Duchess Margaret mentioned almost grudgingly that the boy looked well. Even Mrs. Holt softened, but with acceptance came new dangers. Frederick appeared more frequently, always catching Alice alone, once in the garden itself while George played. "How maternal you have become," he said. "One might almost believe you care for the child rather than securing your position. I do care for him. Unlike some, I do not measure affection by what it might gain me." Frederick laughed. "Spirit without power is merely noise, and you have very little power in this house, perhaps. But I have George's trust and his father's permission, for now. But children are fragile. Accidents happen. Illnesses return. One wonders what would become of your arrangement if something were to happen to the young heir." The threat was unmistakable. Alice felt ice slide down her spine. "If you harm that child, you will what?" Frederick interrupted. "Run to Harry? He already knows I am waiting for his line to fail. Honesty is one of my few virtues." He walked away, leaving Alice trembling. That evening, she could not sleep. Near midnight, she went to Harry's study where lamplight burned. She knocked. "Enter." Harry sat at his desk, coat discarded, shirt sleeves rolled. He looked up, surprised. "Alice." "Is George?" "George is fine." Alice closed the door. "But I need to speak about your cousin." Harry's expression shuttered. "What did Frederick say?" Alice recounted the conversation. Harry's face grew dark. "I will speak to him. Speaking will not stop him." Alice moved closer. "He wants George to fail so he can inherit. As long as he has hope, George is in danger. Frederick would not harm a child. Would he not? Men have done worse for titles. Your cousin hides malice behind charm. I have seen the truth, and it terrifies me." Harry looked at her, really looked. "You care for George." "How could I not? Most women would see him as an obstacle." Another woman's child. I am not most women, and George deserves to be loved, not treated as a pawn. Harry exhaled slowly. I was so focused on protecting him from illness, I did not see the threat in my own house. You see it now. He moved closer until only feet separated them. The study felt intimate, the hour late. Alice was aware of the impropriety, but could not leave. You challenge me at every turn, Harry said quietly. You defy my orders, question my decisions, refuse to be the compliant wife I thought I wanted. I apologize if you have not disappointed me. His voice dropped, rough. You have undone me. You have brought life back to this house, given my son a reason to smile, made me feel things I swore I would never feel again. What things? Hope, anger, desire. His hand cupped her cheek, thumb brushing her jaw. I told myself this would be duty only, that I would never allow another woman into my heart. But you have made that impossible. Her heart raced. I am Alice Blackwood now, yes, you are my wife, and I have treated you abominably. His forehead touched hers. I sent you to sleep with servants. I humiliated you, kept you distant, treated you like a transaction. You were grieving, afraid. That is no excuse. He pulled back to look at her. If I could take back those words, I would. You deserved better. What are you saying? I am saying I was wrong. About you. About us. Somewhere between your defiance and kindness, between watching you with my son and arguing with you, I have fallen for you, and it terrifies me. Why? Because I already lost one wife. The idea of caring again, of risking that pain. His voice broke. Alice covered his hands with hers. I am not Charlotte. I will never be her. But I am here, Harry. I am alive, and I am yours. And I am not going anywhere. Promise me. Promise you will not make me bury another wife. I promise to be careful. But I will not live in fear. Life requires risk. Love requires risk. The word hung between them, acknowledged, but not yet claimed. Harry's control snapped. He pulled her against him and kissed her with desperation that stole her breath. His mouth was hot and demanding, nothing like the cold peck at their wedding. This was hunger, months of denied feeling pouring out. Alice responded without thought, arms wrapping around his neck, body pressing against his. She felt his heart hammering, felt the tremor in his hands as they slid into her hair. When they broke apart, breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I want you. Not as duty. I want you in my bed, as my wife in truth. Then, take me there. He swept her into his arms and carried her through the silent house to his chambers. He set her down gently and lit a lamp with shaking hands. No regrets, he said. If we do this, there is no going back. I do not want to go back. He kissed her again, slower, devastating. His hands found the ties of her wrapper, the buttons of her nightgown. Alice helped him, desperate to feel skin against skin. They came together with intensity that felt inevitable, like something building since that chapel wedding. Harry was tender and fierce by turns, whispering her name like a prayer, touching her as though she were precious. Alice gave herself completely, holding nothing back. This was not cold transaction. This was connection, intimacy. Two people choosing each other despite every reason to remain apart. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. I was a fool, Harry said, to think I could keep you at a distance. I am very persistent. You are extraordinary. He kissed her hair. Tomorrow, we move your belongings to these chambers where they belong. No more sleeping with the maids, never again. You are the Duchess of Ravensmoor. You will sleep beside your husband or nowhere at all. I believe I can accept those terms. They fell asleep wrapped together, ghosts finally quiet, the future no longer something to fear. Outside, dawn was breaking, and in the garden roses bloomed wild and free, waiting for the morning when all three of them would walk there together. Alice woke in Harry's bed for the third morning, her belongings now properly installed in the Duchess's chambers that adjoined his own. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been opened to let in fresh air, and she could hear birdsong from the gardens below. Everything had changed. The servants no longer looked at her with uncertainty. Duchess Margaret had actually smiled at breakfast yesterday. A small thing, but monumental. Harry touched her openly now, his hand on her back as they walked, fingers brushing hers across the dinner table. And George. George was thriving beyond anyone's expectations. She rose and dressed, eager for their morning garden walk. But when she reached the nursery, Betsy met her at the door with a face gone pale. "Your Grace, I think you should come quickly." George lay in his bed, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored. Alice's heart dropped into her stomach. How long has he been like this? Since early morning. It came on so suddenly. One moment he was fine, the next... Alice touched George's forehead. He was burning. She pulled back the covers and saw the telltale rash spreading across his chest and arms. Scarlet fever, the same illness that had taken so many children in the village, that had killed Charlotte. "Send for the physician immediately," Alice said, forcing her voice to remain calm, "and fetch the Duke." Within minutes, Harry burst into the room. One look at his son and all colour drained from his face. "No," he whispered. "Not again. Not like Charlotte." Alice grabbed his hand. "Listen to me, Harry. He is not Charlotte. He is young and he has been getting stronger. We can fight this." The physician arrived an hour later, an older man with cold eyes and older methods. He examined George with impersonal efficiency. "The fever must be broken by any means necessary," he declared. "We will bleed him to release the bad humours and apply hot poultices to draw out the poison." Alice felt ice in her veins. "No, that will weaken him further." The physician looked at her with barely concealed disdain. "Your Grace, I have been practicing medicine for 30 years. I know what is required, and I have watched those methods kill patients." Alice turned to Harry. "Please, I know another way. My mother used herbal remedies during the last outbreak. Cool compresses to bring down the fever, willow bark tea for the pain, plenty of fluids, gentle methods that work with the body, not against it." The physician scoffed. "Superstitious nonsense. If you want this child to survive, you will trust medical science." Harry stood frozen between them, fear and uncertainty warring in his eyes. Alice saw him teetering on the edge of panic, saw him preparing to defer to the physician's authority, because that was what men did in crisis. She touched his face, forcing him to look at her. "Harry, trust me. Please." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he turned to the physician. "Leave us. I will send for you if needed." "Your Grace, this is madness." I said leave. Harry's voice was steel. "This is my wife. This is my son. And I trust her." The physician departed in outrage. Alice immediately began giving orders. Cool water and clean cloths, willow bark from the still room, fresh linens, broth if he can take it. Betsy and the maids moved quickly, grateful to have direction. Harry pulled Alice aside. "If this goes wrong, it will not go wrong. But if it does, if he dies because I listened to you instead of, then we will have tried everything we could with love and hope instead of fear and pain." Alice gripped his hands. "I need you present, Harry, not paralyzed by ghosts. George needs his father." Something in her words reached him. He nodded and moved to his son's bedside. The next 24 hours became a blur of fevered delirium and desperate care. George burned and shivered by turns. Alice kept cool compresses on his forehead, changed his nightshirt when sweat soaked through, coaxed willow bark tea between his cracked lips. Harry stayed the entire time. He held his son's hand and told him stories of his own childhood, of Charlotte before the illness, of the life they would have when he recovered. His voice broke more than once, but he never left. Alice watched father and son together and felt something deep in her chest expand. This was what George had needed all along. Not isolation and protection, but presence and love. As midnight approached, George's fever spiked dangerously high. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Alice applied cool cloths as fast as she could, but the heat seemed unquenchable. Harry gripped her arm. "Alice, he is getting worse." She felt panic rising but pushed it down. "Stay with him. Talk to him. Let him hear your voice." Harry bent over his son. "George, listen to me. You are strong. You are a Blackwood. You can fight this." He looked at Alice, his eyes wet. "Tell him, Alice, tell him he has to stay." Alice knelt on the other side of the bed and took George's small hand. "We need you, darling. Your father needs you. I need you. We have so many more mornings in the garden ahead of us, so many more roses to pick." "Mama," George whispered through cracked lips. Alice felt tears slip down her cheeks. Harry made a sound like something breaking. "Yes, sweetheart," Alice whispered. "Mama is here. And Papa too. We are both here and we are not leaving." As dawn approached, Alice nearly collapsed from exhaustion. She sat back against the wall, her dress ruined with sweat and water, her hair falling from its pins. Harry sank down beside her, taking her hand. "If he dies," Harry said quietly, "I will never forgive myself for all the time I wasted, for keeping him locked away when he should have been living. He is not going to die. You cannot know that." Alice turned to look at him. "I know that we have done everything possible. I know that he has felt more love in these past hours than in all the lonely years before. That matters, Harry. Whatever happens, that matters." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "How did I survive without you? I have no idea." They dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. As the first light of dawn touched the windows, Alice woke to silence. True silence. No labored breathing, no fevered moaning. Terror seized her. She scrambled to George's bedside. His chest rose and fell evenly. His skin, when she touched it, was cool. The fever had broken. "Harry," she breathed. "Harry, look." He was at her side in an instant. Together they watched their son sleep peacefully for the first time in a day and a night. Alice checked the rash, already fading. "He is going to be all right," she whispered. "He survived." Harry made a sound between a laugh and a sob. He pulled Alice into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Thank you. Thank you for saving him. Thank you for making me trust you. We saved him together." They stayed like that until Betsy arrived with fresh linens and hot tea. George woke briefly, asking for water and his mother. Alice gave him both, and he drifted back to sleep with a small smile on his lips. Hours later, after Betsy had taken over the watch and George was resting comfortably, Harry led Alice to his chambers. She was nearly dead on her feet, swaying with exhaustion. "You need to sleep," he said gently. "So do you. In a moment. First, I need to take care of you." He helped her out of her ruined dress with gentle hands, brought warm water and clean cloths, washed the sweat and worry from her skin with a tenderness that made her throat tight. When she was clean and dressed in a fresh nightgown, he carried her to his bed and tucked her in. "Sleep, Alice, I will watch over you." But his own exhaustion was evident. Alice pulled him down beside her. "Lie with me, just for a moment." Harry settled beside her, gathering her close. She tucked her head under his chin and felt his heartbeat slow and steady against her cheek. "I almost lost both of you today," he said quietly. "The thought of it, but you did not. We are here. We are together." His arms tightened around her. "I love you, Alice. I should have said it before, but I am saying it now. I love you more than I thought possible." Alice's heart swelled. "I love you too. From that first moment in the garden with George, perhaps even before. I fell in love with you piece by piece until there was nothing left of me that was not yours." He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of everything they had survived together. The kiss evolved into something more, exhaustion giving way to a different kind of need. The need to affirm life, to celebrate survival, to connect in the most fundamental way. They made love slowly, tenderly, with a reverence born of having faced loss and emerged intact. Harry touched her as though she were made of light, and Alice gave herself to him with complete trust. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the morning sun warming the room. George was safe. The danger had passed. And they had each other. Harry traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "I cannot believe I tried to keep you at a distance, that I wasted even a single day not loving you." Alice smiled. "We have all the days ahead to make up for it." He pulled her closer. "All the days. I promise you, Alice, no more sleeping apart, no more walls, just us together for as long as we both shall live." As they drifted into sleep, wrapped in each other's warmth, Alice thought of George upstairs recovering, of the gardens waiting outside, of the life they were building together from the ashes of grief and fear. They had faced the darkness and found each other in it, and that, she thought as sleep claimed her, was the truest kind of love there was. George's recovery was swift and complete, a testament to Alice's care and his own newfound strength. Within a week he was back in the gardens, running with an energy that made Betsy fret and Alice laugh. The house felt different now, lighter, as though some long-held darkness had finally lifted. Alice no longer slept in the servants' quarters. She woke each morning in Harry's arms, in chambers that finally felt like home. They took breakfast together, walked the gardens with George, appeared as a united family in ways that surprised even the staff. Duchess Margaret observed these changes with an expression Alice could not quite read. One morning, she requested Alice's presence in the drawing room. "You have done well," the older woman said without preamble. "Better than I expected. My grandson thrives, and my son has finally emerged from his self-imposed exile." Alice inclined her head. "Thank you, Your Grace. Do not thank me yet." Margaret's eyes were sharp. "What you have built here is fragile. The world beyond these walls does not take kindly to change, and there are those who will use any weapon against you. You speak of Frederick. I speak of society, of gossip and reputation. You healed George using methods the physician called witchcraft. You defied medical authority. Already whispers are beginning in London. Let them whisper." "Child," Margaret said, and there was something almost kind in her voice. "You cannot ignore society forever. Harry must take his place again. And when he does, you will be scrutinized, judged, torn apart if they find any weakness. Then we will give them no weakness to find." But the warnings proved prophetic. Frederick had not been idle during George's illness. He had been in London, spreading carefully crafted poison. Alice learned of it through a letter that arrived for Harry, its contents making his face go dark with fury. "What is it?" Alice asked. "Frederick has been telling tales, that you used suspicious methods to heal George, that you have bewitched me and turned me against proper medical wisdom, that you are an opportunist who trapped me into marriage and now controls me through unnatural means." Alice felt cold spread through her chest. Do people believe him? Harry crumpled the letter. "Some do, enough that we must act. We can no longer hide here pretending the world does not exist. What do you propose?" "A ball. Here at Ravensmoor, a formal presentation of you as my Duchess. We invite everyone of consequence. We show them a united front, and we silence the rumors through visibility rather than denial. That could backfire spectacularly. Or it could work." Harry took her hands. "I am tired of hiding, Alice. Tired of letting fear dictate my choices. I want to stand beside you in front of the entire world and dare anyone to question what we have built." Alice felt a surge of love for this man who had come so far from the frozen duke who had ordered her to sleep with the maids. "Very well. When?" 3 weeks. That gives us time to prepare, to ensure George is strong enough to make a brief appearance if needed. If needed. A child calling you mother in front of witnesses carries more weight than 1,000 denials, Harry said quietly. The preparations began immediately. Invitations were sent to every important family within 100 miles. The ballroom was opened for the first time in years, Holland covers removed, chandeliers cleaned and lit. The house came alive with activity. Alice worked alongside Duchess Margaret, learning the intricacies of hosting an event of this scale. Who should be seated where, which families were feuding, what menu would impress without seeming ostentatious. "You are a quick study," Margaret admitted one afternoon. Charlotte was naturally gracious, but you have something she lacked. "Steel beneath the silk." "I had to develop steel early," Alice replied. "Silk came later." As the date approached, nerves began to fray. Alice stood for countless dress fittings, her gown an emerald silk that made her eyes luminous. Harry insisted on being present for the final fitting, his gaze never leaving her. "You are breathtaking," he said when the modiste left. "I am terrified." He pulled her close. "We face this together. Whatever happens, we are united." The morning of the ball, George appeared at their chamber door, dressed in his finest clothes. "I want to help," he announced. "I want everyone to know that Alice is my mother now, and that she saved my life." Harry knelt to his son's level. "Are you certain? It will be many people, much noise and attention." George lifted his chin in a gesture so like his father, it made Alice's throat tight. "I am certain. She was brave for me. Now, I will be brave for her." As evening fell, carriages began arriving. Alice stood beside Harry at the entrance, greeting guests with a composure she did not entirely feel. She saw the curious stares, the whispered comments behind fans, the assessment in every eye. Frederick arrived fashionably late, his smile sharp as knives. "Cousin, how delightful to see you emerging from your hermitage. And dear Alice, looking quite the Duchess. One would hardly know you were sleeping with the servants mere weeks ago." The nearby guests went silent. Alice felt Harry tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand gently. "One would hardly know you were waiting like a vulture for a child to die, Captain Ashford. But here we are, full of surprises." Frederick's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. "Indeed. I do hope the evening proves illuminating for everyone." He moved past them into the ballroom, and Alice released a shaky breath. "That was well done," Harry murmured. "I am only getting started." The ballroom was magnificent, candles blazing in crystal chandeliers, musicians playing softly from the gallery. Alice danced the opening dance with Harry, aware of every eye upon them. "They are judging every step," she whispered. "Then we give them nothing to judge but perfection," he replied, and spun her through a turn that made her skirts bell out like flower petals. As the evening progressed, Alice began to relax slightly. She conversed with matrons and charmed gentlemen, all while keeping Harry in her peripheral vision. They were a team, working the room together, presenting a united front. Then came the moment Harry had planned. The music paused. Harry took Alice's hand and led her to the center of the ballroom. A servant appeared with George, freshly woken and still in his nightclothes, rubbing his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harry's voice carried across the room, "I have lived in darkness for 3 years, believing that duty required sacrifice, and that love was a weakness I could not afford." He looked at Alice. "Then my mother arranged a marriage I did not want, to a woman I was determined to keep at a distance." The crowd was utterly silent. "I sent my wife to sleep in the servants' quarters," Harry continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I forbade her access to my son. I treated her with coldness and cruelty because I was too afraid to feel anything again." Alice felt tears prick her eyes, unsure where he was going with this confession. "But Alice Blackwood is not a woman who accepts cruelty quietly," Harry said, and there was pride in his voice now. "She defied me. She healed my son when I would have let fear kill him. She brought light back into this house and into my life. She taught me that the only way to honor the dead is to remember how to live." He raised Alice's hand to his lips. "She is my wife, my partner, and the woman I love. Anyone who questions her place in this family, her methods, or her character will answer to me directly." The room erupted in whispers. Then George, prompted by Betsy, ran across the ballroom floor and threw his arms around Alice's waist. "Mama saved me," he said loudly, clearly. "Papa was scared, but Mama knew what to do. She made me better." The whispers grew louder, but now they carried a different tone. Approval, perhaps, or at least respect. Duchess Margaret stepped forward, surprising everyone. "The child speaks truth. My grandson lives because this woman had courage when the rest of us had only fear. She is a credit to the Blackwood name, and I am proud to call her daughter." Alice felt her knees go weak. Harry's arm around her waist was the only thing keeping her upright. Frederick stood at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of barely contained rage. He had been outmaneuvered, publicly, and there was nothing he could say without seeming petty or cruel. The orchestra resumed playing. Couples returned to dancing, and Alice found herself surrounded by women who had ignored her before, now eager to know more about her herbal remedies, her methods, her story. Hours later, when the last guests had departed, Alice stood in the now empty ballroom with Harry. George had long since been carried back to bed, exhausted but happy. "We did it," she said softly. "You did it." Harry pulled her close. "You faced them all and won them over with nothing but truth and grace. We faced them together." He kissed her, long and deep, there in the empty ballroom where they had just claimed their place in society. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. No more hiding, no more walls. Just us, building a life together in the light. Alice smiled. I believe I can accept those terms. They walked through the quiet house hand in hand, past sleeping servants and dying candles, up the stairs to their chambers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles. Frederick was not defeated, only temporarily beaten. But tonight, they had won. They had stood together before the world and declared their love without shame or apology. And that, Alice thought as Harry pulled her into his arms and into their bed, was victory enough for now. Outside, the first hints of spring touched the air. In the garden, buds were forming on the rose bushes. And inside Ravensmoor Abbey, a family that had been broken was finally, truly whole. The darkness had lifted, the walls had come down, and love, against all odds, had won. Spring arrived at Ravensmoor Abbey like a promise kept. The gardens exploded with colour, roses climbing walls that had been bare for years, ivy turning from brown to vibrant green. The house itself seemed to breathe differently, as though it had finally remembered what it meant to be a home, rather than a monument to grief. Alice stood at her window, watching George race across the lawn with a puppy Harry had brought home last week. The boy's laughter carried on the wind, clear and joyful, the sound of a childhood finally being lived. A year had passed since the ball that changed everything. A year of small victories and quiet joys, of building a life from the ashes of what had been. Frederick had disappeared from their lives after that night, his ambitions thwarted, his poison ineffective. Rumours said he had taken a commission abroad, preferring distance to the humiliation of watching Harry's family thrive. Alice did not spare him much thought. He had been a shadow, and shadows disappeared in sufficient light. The real changes were subtler, deeper. Harry smiled now easily and often. He played with George in the gardens, taught him to ride, told him stories of his mother without that terrible weight of guilt. Charlotte's memory was honoured, but no longer a prison. Duchess Margaret had become an unexpected ally, even a friend. She had moved to the Dower House but visited frequently, bringing gifts for George and advice for Alice that was occasionally even helpful. And Alice herself had transformed from the desperate girl accepting an arranged marriage into a woman who knew her own power. She was Duchess of Ravensmoor, not because a contract said so, but because she had earned it, fought for it, claimed it as her own. Tonight would be another test, another statement, the annual spring ball, the first they were hosting since the previous year's triumph. But this time, there would be no rumours to combat, no reputations to salvage. This was pure celebration. Alice descended the stairs to find Harry waiting in the entrance hall, devastatingly handsome in his evening clothes. His eyes lit when he saw her in the gown they had chosen together, sapphire silk that brought out the blue in her eyes. "You grow more beautiful every day," he said, pulling her close. "How did I ever think I could live without you?" "Stubbornness and fear," Alice replied, smiling against his chest. "You were very determined. I was an idiot. You were grieving. There is a difference." George appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in miniature evening clothes that made him look absurdly grown up. "Can I stay for the whole ball this time, Papa? Please?" Harry looked at Alice, who nodded. "The whole ball, my boy. You have earned it." As guests began to arrive, Alice felt none of the nerves from last year. These were friends now, or at least friendly acquaintances. People who had watched her weather Frederick's attacks, who had seen George's recovery, who had witnessed a marriage transform from cold arrangement to genuine partnership. The dancing began with Alice and Harry taking the floor together. She felt the rightness of it, the way they moved as one, the way his hand at her waist felt like home. "I have something for you," Harry whispered as they turned. "A gift. It is not my birthday. It does not need to be." After the dance, he led her to a quiet corner where a large package waited, wrapped in cloth. Alice pulled the covering away and gasped. It was a portrait, not of Charlotte, though she was there, painted in the background among the roses. The foreground showed Alice and Harry and George together in the garden, the three of them laughing, alive, real. The artist had captured something essential, some truth about what they had become. "So that anyone who enters this house knows," Harry said softly. "This is our family, past and present together, honored and loved." Alice felt tears slip down her cheeks. "It is perfect. Like you." She kissed him there in front of everyone, not caring who saw, not caring what anyone thought. This was her husband, her love, her choice. Later in the evening, George appeared at her elbow, tugging her dress. "Mama, everyone keeps asking me about you, about how you made me better. And what do you tell them?" "That you are magic," he said simply. "That you brought Papa back to life and me too, and now we are a real family." "Oh, darling," Alice knelt to his level. "We are a real family, and you are the bravest boy I know. Can I tell you a secret?" George leaned close. "I am glad Grandmama made Papa marry you. I know it was supposed to be just for duty, but I think maybe she knew you would save us." "Maybe she did," Alice agreed, glancing across the room where Duchess Margaret was holding court, looking almost pleased with herself. As the night drew to a close and the last guests departed, Alice found herself in the garden with Harry and George. The three of them sat on the bench where Alice had first brought George all those months ago, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. "Are you happy, Papa?" George asked suddenly. Harry pulled his son close with one arm, his other around Alice. "Happier than I ever thought possible, my boy. Happier than I deserve." "You deserve it," Alice said firmly. "We all do." George yawned, fighting sleep. "Will it always be like this? All of us together?" "Always," Harry promised. "We are a family now. Nothing will change that." They carried George up to bed together, both of them tucking him in, both of them kissing his forehead. As they left the nursery, Betsy smiled at them with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a miracle. In their chambers, Harry helped Alice from her gown with gentle, familiar hands. They had done this dance 100 times now, the intimate ritual of undressing, of letting down guards, of coming together as equals. "Do you remember," Harry said as he unlaced her stays, "when I told you to sleep with the maids?" Alice turned to face him. "I remember everything. The coldness, the cruelty, the walls you built. I wish I could take it back." She touched his face. "I do not. If you had been kind from the beginning, we would never have had to fight for this. We would never have had to choose each other. It made us stronger. How did you become so wise? Necessity, and stubbornness, and love for a little boy who needed someone to see him." Harry kissed her, slow and deep, and love for a broken duke who needed someone to save him from himself. "We saved each other," Alice whispered. They made love that night with the windows open to spring air, with the scent of roses drifting in, with the knowledge that they had built something real and lasting from the coldest of beginnings. No ghosts haunted them, no fears divided them. Only love remained, fierce and true and hard-won. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Harry spoke into the darkness. "I never believed in second chances. I thought when Charlotte died, that was the end of everything worth having. But you gave me a second chance at life, at love, at being a father. You gave me a future I had stopped believing in. And you gave me a home," Alice replied. "A real home, not just a house or a title. You gave me family, purpose, love. You gave me everything." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, the future bright and certain ahead of them. 2 years later, on a perfect spring morning, Alice stood in the garden watching George teach his little sister how to pick roses. Margaret Rose Blackwood, named for both grandmothers, toddled through the flowers with determined steps, her dark curls bouncing. Harry came up behind Alice and wrapped his arms around her, resting his hand on her belly where their third child grew. "Content?" he murmured against her ear. "Completely." The house behind them was alive with noise and laughter, servants who smiled, Duchess Margaret arguing cheerfully with the cook over dinner menus. The ghosts had been replaced by life, the silence by joy. Alice thought back to that rain-soaked day when she had stood beside her father's grave, accepting a marriage proposal that felt like a prison sentence. She had been so afraid, so desperate, so certain she was trading her freedom for survival. She had been wrong. She had not traded her freedom. She had fought for it, claimed it, transformed it into something stronger than she had ever imagined. The walls of Ravensmoor had become a garden. The end of one life had become the beginning of another, and the marriage that was supposed to be cold duty had become the truest love she had ever known. George called out, "Mama, Papa, come look." Maggie picked her first rose. They walked together toward their children, toward the life they had built from grief and fear and impossible odds. The sun was warm on Alice's face. Harry's hand was firm in hers, and ahead of them stretched all the bright tomorrows they had earned. Sometimes, Alice thought, the most beautiful things grow from the darkest soil. Sometimes love is not given but fought for, won in battles both quiet and loud, claimed inch by inch until it becomes unshakable. And sometimes, if you are very brave and very stubborn and very lucky, the coldest winter can transform into the most glorious spring. She had entered his life as an obligation, a transaction sealed with cold words and colder distance. But Alice Blackwood proved that love cannot be locked away, that walls built from fear will always crumble before courage, and that the heart capable of the deepest grief is also capable of the most profound joy. In choosing to see the man beneath the ice, in refusing to accept cruelty as destiny, she did not just save a marriage or heal a child. She reminded them all that being alive means risking pain for the chance at something beautiful. What prison have you built around your own heart? What walls are you ready to let crumble? If this story moved you, I would be deeply grateful if you would leave a like. It helps more people find these tales of love and redemption. Please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story, and I would love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Knowing you are out there, connecting with these characters across distances makes every word worth writing. Thank you for being here.